Senator O'Mara.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the sponsor yield for a couple questions?
Will the sponsor yield? The sponsor yields.
Pertaining to the 1 day of rest a week, the 24-hour rule and the day off, that worker, farm laborer, can choose to work on that day off if they so choose, the 7th day of the week, and the farm employer is required to pay time and a half, at least, overtime wages, correct?
That is correct, and now that they'll have driver's licenses, they'll also be able to choose to go to church, visit relatives, and just enjoy the New York countryside.
That'd be great, but they could already use their foreign driver's license
Senator
from
O'Mara,
the country they came from.
Are you asking the sponsor to yield?
Mr. President, will the sponsor yield?
The sponsor yield.
So if that, we have the old adage in agriculture that you've got to make hay while the sun is shining. So agriculture is very weather dependent. And say given during the course of a week, a farm worker, because of the weather, is only able to work 4 or 5 hours a day for those 6 days, and has therefore only worked 24 to 30 hours in that week, they haven't reached the 60-hour threshold. They still cannot choose to work on their day off and without the farmer having to pay them time and a half, correct?
Correct, but there is a provision in the bill that states that if the worker wasn't able to work that day because of inclement weather, that can count as their day of rest.
But if they worked any hour, through you, Mr. President, but the way I read it, if they worked any hours during that day before getting rained out or frozen out or whatever, that does not count as their day off, right?
Yes, Mr. President.
Okay. So, through you, Mr. President.
Does the sponsor yield for a question? Sponsor yields.
So, the farm laborer that gets rained out or whatever for a number of days that week comes to his boss on the 7th day and says, geez, boss, I only got 30 hours of work this week. I really need to work today. And the farm boss is going to say, well, I'd love to have you work, Charlie, but I can't afford to pay you time and a half. So you can't work here today. Is that correct under this law?
President, if they already had, under that scenario, their 24 hours of rest, well, then they've already complied with that, and it's not about overtime pay.
Through you, Mr. President, that was not my scenario. My scenario was they worked for 6 days, partial days, only accumulated a total of 24 to 30 hours in that week. Now they can't work the 7th day without getting paid time and a half.
And so what I added was that if within those hours there was 24 consecutive hours off, then that would count as their day off.
Okay. Through you, Mr. President.
Are you asking the sponsor? Will the sponsor yield?
Sponsor yield.
Sponsor yields.
I guess I could see that happening under certain circumstances, but if it doesn't happen that way, and the farmer says, I'm not going to pay you overtime on day 7, that farm laborer doesn't get to work that day to get paid, at least at that farm. Now, let's go to the, through you, Mr. President, if the sponsor will still yield.
Sponsor yield? Sponsor yields.
On the prior senator had mentioned housing costs for farm laborers and or housing being provided and other amenities or benefits. Under this bill that you have, is there anything that would preclude the farmer from charging the farm laborer for that housing or other benefits?
No, Mr. President, the bill does not address that.
Through you, Mr. President, if the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield? The sponsor yields.
Let's talk about the wage board for a minute. The wage board is made up of 3 individuals. Who appoints those 3 individuals?
Just like the first time this question was asked, the Farm Bureau or the employers would determine who their representative is. That's one person. The other person would be determined by the AFL-CIO, the workers, and the third person would be determined by the Commissioner of Labor in consultation with the Commissioner of Agriculture and Markets.
Okay. Through you, Mr. President, the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
So the legislature has no role of confirming any one of the three members to this commission.
That is correct, Mr. President.
Through you, Mr. President, the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Under the Wage Board section, as I read it, the Wage Board has to meet by March 1st of 2020.
Correct, Mr. President.
Through you, Mr. President.
Will the sponsor yield for another question?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
This law takes effect January 1st, 2020, so 2 months before that date, correct?
Correct, Mr. President.
Through you, Mr. President, sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
The Wage Board is required to hold public hearings no later than the first one, being 45 days after the Wage Board is convened, correct?
Correct, Mr. President.
And they have to report, through you, Mr. President, the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
And the Wage Board has to do a report by December 31st, 2020, but if they get their work done earlier, they could report earlier, correct?
If they so choose, Mr. President.
And then, through you, Mr. President,
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
when the Wage Board reports back to the Commissioner of Labor, the Commissioner of Labor shall immediately implement the recommendations of that Wage Board, correct?
And nowhere in the bill does it say immediately.
Through you, Mr. President.
Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Yeah.
Sponsor yields.
The language does state that the Commissioner shall comply with the report, though, correct? Even though it doesn't say immediately.
Okay. Commissioner statement, I'm sorry, I don't know what that was.
It was a question. So the Commissioner is required to follow the recommendations of the Wage Board once they're received, although it doesn't say immediately.
That is correct, Mr. President.
So, in essence, since this board, through you, Mr. President, sponsor will
Will
yield,
the sponsor yield?
Yes.
this
Sponsor yields.
Wage Board, if it's appointed timely, which is a long shot around here, and it has to meet by March 1st, 2020, and it has to have public hearings in 45 days from when they were first appointed. So 45 days, if they're there on January 1st, would be about the middle of February. They could have completed their work and issue a report by the end of February to the Commissioner of Labor if they do this very quickly, correct?
Choose, Mr. President.
And in that case, through you, Mr. President,
Will the sponsor
yield,
Will the sponsor yield? Sponsor yields.
then the Commissioner of Labor, around late February, under this timing scenario, could completely undo what's set forth in this law that we're doing here now. It could lower the 60 hours to 40 hours, correct?
I'm so sorry if the senator could repeat his question.
Gladly. So if they do their work expeditiously and they issue a report by the end of February 2020, that goes to the Commissioner, and the Commissioner has to follow those recommendations, albeit not immediately, but if he chooses to do so, or she chooses to do so, and the Wage Board recommends that the hours should be 40 hours rather than 60 before overtime kicks in, that would go into effect, say, in March of 2020.
I believe that the board would have to determine when the new threshold would have to go into effect based on the indicators that they've analyzed. But this would be a very unprecedented thing. The way wage boards have traditionally worked, They've provided very thorough analysis and made recommendations that are smart and responsible.
Mr. President?
Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Sure.
The sponsor yields.
I would certainly agree with you that that's certainly the way things usually work around here because nothing gets done timely. But under the scenario I've laid out, it could happen, and the wage board could recommend that the threshold is 40 hours for overtime before the end of February in 2020.
They could, Mr. President.
Now, if the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Now, Section 6 on page 11 indicates that the wage board shall consider existing overtime rates in similarly situated industries in New York State. Can the sponsor tell us what your intent is and what other similarly situated industries are in New York State?
Yeah, Mr. President, the purpose of the board is to determine exactly that.
Through you, Mr. President,
Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
can you provide me any examples of similarly situated industries in New York State?
This mechanism, Mr. President, recognizing how unique the farm industry is. And that's why we've decided to proceed this way.
To you, Mr. President.
Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
So is it your opinion then that the farming and agricultural industry in New York is so unique that there are not other similarly situated industries in New York State?
Mr. President, yeah, I believe that farm work is very different than a lot of other work. I mean, maybe it's comparable, especially as in regards to the toil it takes on your body physically to construction work somewhat, but it's a different industry with much more wealthier employers, and in that way is not really comparable to the agricultural industry.
To you, Mr. President.
Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Yes.
The sponsor yields.
Senator, that is my point, that farming is unique, that it doesn't line up with any other similar industries, and that's why it's been treated differently for as long as it has, and why it's been treated specially. And the uniqueness and the burdens to the farmer, the farm owner, and the industry dictates that sometimes normal hours don't fit in the farming schedule. Would you agree?
Mr. President, I would beg to differ. I would say that the reason that farm workers were carved out of the New York State Constitution and aren't afforded many labor rights in comparison to other workers is because when our Constitution was written, most farm workers were black. So I would argue that the reason why these workers have been carved out traditionally, and even in the New Deal, I would argue, when there was still a lot of sharecroppers, is because of racism.
If the sponsor will yield.
Will the sponsor yield for a
Yes.
question?
On the wage board recommendations, can the wage board come back and recommend less than 40 hours requiring overtime to be paid to the farm laborer?
Mr. President, that is not outlined in the bill. So in theory, yes, it's possible, but not probable.
On the bill, Mr. President.
Senator O'Mara on the bill.
Mr. President, this legislation is nothing more than a sham and a front to cover up changing an entire industry through a wage board set up by this body that we have no control over, no say over, no ability to check and change what they come up with. We are stuck with what the wage board comes up with. And as these boards are put together, we know that the deck is stacked against business and against that farm owner. This is another example of us passing the buck here and not making the tough decisions ourselves. You know, 2 years ago, the legislature passed a legislative pay commission because we didn't have the balls to pass a raise for ourselves. And we're living with the result of that now. Then this year, we created 2 more commissions. One for congestion pricing or a commuter tax on taxpayers in New York City that will put burdens on New York City workers and residents to what level we don't know. But we know from track records it will not be good. We have set forth another commission to set up taxpayer finance campaigns because this body didn't have the guts to make the decision of what that should be or not be. We will pay the price for that at well over $200 million a year. Now we pass the buck because we can't make a tough choice on how to treat farm workers, the way they've traditionally operated the industry in New York State. I would argue the most important industry in New York State, the most basic and necessary industry in New York State. And we stand today taking action that will crush, potentially, this industry in New York State. Thank you, Mr. President.